Well, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I believe we have people joining us from many different places for this webinar, which is very exciting. My name is Melissa Kelly, and I'm a research fellow with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University, also known by its shortened name, CERC Migration. Today's webinar is the collaborative effort between the Monash Migration and Inclusion Centre and CERC Migration. This webinar has also been organized in conjunction with a blog series called Migrant Futures, which CERC Migration runs in collaboration with Open Democracy. I highly encourage you to check out the blog space if you haven't done so already. We will share the link to the chat box shortly. Today's topic of discussion is the future of migration to small and mid-sized cities. Many small and mid-sized cities have come to rely on international migrants to fill labor shortages and counter the effects of population decline. The pandemic, however, has slowed international migration, making it difficult for small and mid-sized cities to recruit new migrants. Newcomers may also face new integration challenges due to the social and economic changes brought about by COVID-19. With this webinar, we would like to explore what the future of migration to small and mid-sized cities might look like, and what can be done to ensure that smaller communities continue to benefit from international migration in the post-pandemic context. We are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of speakers from both Australia and Canada joining us today. Each speaker will deliver some brief remarks. Please feel free to pose questions in the chat, and after all three speakers have had the chance to speak, we will allow some time for Q&A. Starting us off today will be Rebecca Wicks. Rebecca is the director of the Monash Migration and Inclusion Centre at Monash University in Australia. She will be followed by Attar Akbari. Attar is a professor at the Sobey School of Business at St. Mary's University in Canada. And finally, we have Anna Ziersch, an associate professor at the Flinders Health and Medical Research Institute at Flinders University in Canada. For the Q&A component of this session, she will be joined by her colleague Clemence Dew from the University of Adelaide. Rebecca just published an exciting blog this week on our Migrant Futures blog series. We will share the link in the chat so that you can easily access it. Rebecca, in your blog, you talked about how Australia's regions need a new immigration plan after the pandemic. I would therefore like to ask you, what were the challenges for regional migration in Australia prior to the pandemic? And do you think these challenges will be overcome or exacerbated in the post-COVID recovery period? Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and my deepest thanks to CERC for inviting us here today. It's really quite a pleasure. If you don't mind, before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm meeting with you today and to acknowledge when sovereignty was never ceded. I recognize the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, as the ongoing custodians of the lands in which I stand, and I pay my respects to them and their past, present, and future communities. So thank you so much for having me. The question you ask is a really great one because we started to think about regional migration quite seriously in 2019 when the federal government made some significant changes to the regional migration policy. And by regions, we mean, smaller towns and cities in Australia outside of the large capital cities, such as Melbourne and Sydney, which are the traditional migrant settlement hubs. So these regional changes essentially privileged people who would commit to living in the regions. And so for skilled migration as well as temporary migration, visa gaps, the regions were seen as a desirable place to go because it gave you more points in your quest to be a permanent migrant here. But the reality was, and some colleagues and I did some research on this back in 2019, the reality is that apart from large cities that really, we wouldn't argue really are regions per se from a geographic classification, but from a government classification, migrants have already been living in these areas for decades, and they sort of emulate the same sort of city vibe that that Melbourne and Sydney offer, and thus moving migrants into other areas just really wasn't well thought out. Now there's been a lot of labor shortage in these areas, and a lot of local governments are really keen to increase migration into those areas and are calling out for migrants to come and live in those areas. But there's really no strategy. The strategies vary by local government to local government. The federal strategy is just really to try to place migrants into these regional areas. And for many of these regional areas, even those that have had some history of migration, it has been largely migration from European countries, from essentially Anglo-Celtic countries. There's a lot of white diversity, not a lot of language diversity, diversity of color. And a lot of these areas are just simply not ready in terms of the kind of housing availability that might be there for them, in terms of the welcoming attitudes that are needed for successful settlement, and in terms of sustainable jobs and sustainable futures for migrants going into those areas, in terms of the availability of tertiary education, of career trajectories. So there were already significant challenges in the regions as it related to boosting migration. And my colleague Anna, who will be talking later about refugee migration, I think will speak very clearly about the challenges for those particular groups. The other thing that we sort of saw prior to COVID was that, getting back to those community attitudes, was that even the most successful multicultural regional areas, so for example, Shepparton, we've just done some work in this area, that it's really a coexistence model rather than a truly integrated, culturally integrated model. And what I mean by that is that migrants are there and they're living there and they're able to, to find gainful employment and practice their religion and cultural practices. And every so often there's a festival celebrating diversity, but that diversity is sitting side by side rather than hand in hand. And whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, I think can be debated. But the reality is that level of integration, even in our most diverse regional towns, is still somewhat separate, I think, in terms of its day-to-day processes. When COVID hit, I think that temporary migrants in particular were really thrown into a state of chaos. Our federal government offered them no soft landing, absolutely no soft landing. There were no benefits that were available for temporary migrants who decided to remain in this country. And a lot of these migrants were, of course, international students, and many of them, I'm sure, in Anna's university, Clements University, my university, and my word that they struggle. And the government's response to that was, well, you know what, you don't like it, go home. And this is a rhetoric that I think has been throughout Australia's history about migrants when they're doing it tough and when they're tough times. Well, you don't like Australia, go back to where you came from. And in fact, we have a television show that was called that, which was trying to push back on some of these myths and cultural misunderstandings about migrants in this country. So he really, the Prime Minister really set the scene that if you can't ride it out here without services, you're not welcome. And in the recent federal budget, even for those who are coming now as permanent migrants, there's going to be a 4-year lag on pretty much any benefit that would facilitate an economically easy settlement into this country. And they're going to say, the federal government will say, millions of dollars, but what is this going to mean for migrant communities who are coming to Australia? What is this going to mean for them going to the regions? So I think there's a degree of precariousness in the increased temporary populations that we've seen. There's no safety net for them. There has been some indication of increased hostile attitudes towards certain groups of migrants. And I do worry that as we kind of recover from COVID-19 and the struggles that we've experienced in the last, 16, 17 months, that if we don't really work on that regional readiness, if we're not really aware of the kinds of contexts that migrants are going to be settling into, and we don't have the infrastructure, both social and economic, to sustain them over time as they settle and to draw them there and retain them there, then I think all of these points that are going to encourage people to move to regional areas are going to be for naught, because they just simply won't stay. So I feel as though the cracks that we had before COVID-19 in terms of regional settlement strategies will still remain. It's still going to fall onto the shoulders of local governments really to be working hand in glove with the communities to prepare those communities for increases in migrant population. And as I said, they vary from place to place. Some do it very well, others do not do it very well at all. And there's just a haphazard approach, I think, that will only exacerbate whatever tensions and cracks were there prior to COVID. So I think that's probably enough for me in terms of answering that question.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate your emphasis on the importance of improving social inclusion and addressing inequalities as we try to rebuild local economies and societies following the pandemic. Next, I would like to invite Attar Akbari to give his perspective on the Canadian context. Attar and his co-author Jigme Chorab from Halifax Partnership have also written a blog, and it will be published very shortly alongside Rebecca's, so watch out for that. Attar, in your blog, you argued that the pandemic presents a somewhat paradoxical opportunity for small and mid-sized cities. So I would like to ask you, what challenges and opportunities do you think small and mid-sized cities will face when trying to successfully attract and retain immigrants following the pandemic?
Thank you, Melissa, and also it was good to hear Rebecca about the situation in Australia. Our governments have different responses to immigrant settlement, it looks like. In terms of attraction and retention, there are many economic and non-economic factors that determine attraction and retention towards destinations. Economic factors include job opportunities, salaries, cost of living, including accommodation. Non-economic factors include welcoming communities, presence of immigrant population, opportunity to raise children, lifestyle, by which I mean open space, recreation areas, natural environment, etc. Now, COVID-19, as we all know, has changed the way we do business and also socially interact with each other. There is more reliance now on technology for these matters, and this is expected to continue in the near future. So while this opened up the possibility for people to settle in regional centers, it may compound the integration challenges that newcomers face. So for example, in the absence of a physical office space, how will they make connections with colleagues? Building social and professional networks through online meetings is particularly difficult, as you know. Access to devices will continue to be an issue for families if every family member is expected to work, study, communicate virtually. The digital literacy divide will be even more felt among those older who have a lower English proficiency, and also among women in particular. They will need time to build these skills, and these new challenges resulting from the pandemic will make newcomer integration more complex. Now, on top of that, there is housing challenge as well. Newcomers face housing challenges, and in the initial years in Canada, they tend to reside in rental accommodations. Due to their overall lower COVID-19 incidence rates and a shift towards remote work, some mid and small-sized cities that can offer more space and an attractive natural environment have become magnets for those residing in larger cities where the incidence rates are higher. So as a result, what has happened is that the housing demand has risen sharply outside of large urban centers. And supply has not been able to keep up with the demand because of supply chain disruptions in building materials and appliances. So what we are seeing now is rapidly rising and for some unaffordable housing prices. So just outside my window, I see two houses there. Both of them were bought by families who moved from Ontario, and they were sold at higher than the prices at which they were listed. And it has never happened in Halifax before. So the rising, and now because of this rising and unaffordable house prices, this is likely to cause greater demand for rental accommodation, which also faces supply bottlenecks, and hence a consequent rise in rents is inevitable. So as a result of this, a rise in multiple family dwellings is expected, where social distancing can be a major issue, making newcomers more vulnerable to COVID-19. Now, so those are some of the challenges in terms of social integration, in terms of jobs, in terms of housing. But at the same time, there are some opportunities also which COVID-19 presents. Smaller cities like those in Atlantic Canada have been less impacted by the pandemic. So as I was saying before the start of this session, that if we get 15 cases, it makes a big news. But in larger cities like in Toronto or in the Ontario province, we hear cases have risen up until 4,000 per day. So smaller cities like Atlantic Canada have been less impacted by the pandemic, which gives them a competitive advantage over larger cities in attracting newcomers, immigrants as well as non-immigrants alike, when considering the increasing tendency to work from home. So I will ask Sindhu to put that website, if you can, by sharing your screen. The province of Nova Scotia has already launched a new campaign to bring people to Nova Scotia. And I just wanted to show you this website. So on this website, it shows that the province has launched a campaign to bring people to Nova Scotia by advertising that this is a place where they can enjoy living in an open space, a beautiful natural environment, while maintaining their employment by working from home. Now, of course, for these promotion initiatives to have a lasting effect in attracting immigrants, we need carefully designed settlement and integration policies, which are essential. Okay, so I will stop here and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Attar. It was really interesting to hear your perspective, and it's nice to know that despite the many challenges, you do see some potential for positive change coming out of the new circumstances created by the pandemic. So now we'll move back to the Australian context. Anna, you have co-authored a piece with Clement Stu, which will also be featured in the Migrant Futures blog series in the near future. Based on your blog, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about what you think can be done post-pandemic to enhance refugee resettlement outcomes outside of Australia's major urban centres. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this. Thanks to Attar and Rebecca for their remarks. It's really interesting to have this cross-country perspective. I'd also just like to start by acknowledging that I'm meeting today on the lands of the Kaurna people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who aren't in Australia, I thought I'd just give a brief overview of our humanitarian program. So we have an offshore program for people who arrive in Australia with a permanent visa. It's got a current annual quota of around almost 19,000 people per year. We also have an onshore program for people who don't arrive with a humanitarian visa. And since 2013, those who are arriving in mainland Australia are only eligible for a temporary refugee visa. There's one which is a temporary protection visa for 3 years and one called the Safe Haven Enterprise visa, which is for 5 years. But unlike, I believe, in Canada, the humanitarian program is still running. It's largely paused in Australia at the moment. So in terms of regional humanitarian migration, so in 2019-20, around 45% were settled in regional areas. The inverted commas is, as Rebecca refers to, what is determined as regional might mean some larger cities, not Melbourne and Sydney, but still larger than some of the rural areas. There was a target in for 2022 of 50%. That was a pre-COVID goal. So there are a range of pathways by which people can come to be in a regional area through the humanitarian program. It might be they originally settled there or moved there after they've settled somewhere else. Might be as part of a government initiated program through their choice, or some of the receiving communities also have initiatives. So as people have talked about, there are a range of benefits of regional migration for refugees. There has been historically affordable housing, some more employment opportunities, and a sense of community, particularly for people who have come from smaller regional areas themselves. For receiving communities, economic growth, supply of labour and enriched local culture. And for humanitarian settlement providers, there is the potential for more coordinated services and a spread of need. But like both Athel and Rebecca have talked about, there have been issues around retention, so a lack of access to culturally appropriate services in smaller areas. Some of the breadth of employment and educational offerings have led people to move to larger cities, the size and diversity of cultural communities, and also, as Rebecca mentioned, issues around racism and discrimination. So what are the opportunities given some of the social and economic impacts on regional areas and the pause of the humanitarian program? How can we improve that resettlement process post-pandemic? So we know that there have been a range of reviews of humanitarian settlement programs. We know the importance of the availability of settlement services and having appropriate infrastructure and services, genuine capacity for economic integration, and partnership and consultation with communities. Post-COVID, so then regional areas, there have been economic impacts, both in terms of economic downturn in some industries, but also labour shortages in regional areas, particularly in the agricultural and horticultural sectors. So in the past, there have been some local initiatives of matching employers with refugee communities. It's been fairly haphazard, and there's a real opportunity here to have that in a more coordinated fashion. As Athel talked about, housing affordability is becoming an issue in some of the regional areas. And particularly for incoming refugees, there can be a range of barriers to accessing housing, competing in that market without local references, social networks. So there's a real opportunity or importance for settlement providers to help with that process through potentially head leasing properties, rent relief from government, a whole range of education required about accessing housing in regional, just more generally. As Rebecca said, also there has been some suggestions of a rise in racism and discrimination from particular groups. And I think we'll get onto this with some of the discussions later about some of the ways that some of that more genuine welcome and integration can happen. So the importance of really working with local communities to plan refugee migration into an area, having local champions, having local newspapers on board. We have a Welcoming Cities initiative, which Rebecca's been involved in looking at also, which has worked with local councils to prepare local communities and to progress cohesion. In Australia, the reason I mentioned before the CHEV visa is that was actually developed to encourage regional resettlement for refugees. So someone on that 5-year visa has to work or study in the region for at least 3.5 to 5 of the 5 years. But the temporary visas, people must reapply for them. They get access to most services, but there's no family reunion, there's restrictions on travel, people have to pay international tertiary education fees, and there's this really ongoing uncertainty. Also, because people have to move to meet that work criteria, they're more likely to move from region to region, and there's a risk of employment exploitation in those areas. There is a pathway to permanent visas for the CHEV holders only through the skill program, but it's got very stringent work, language and education requirements, and actually so far no one's been able to transition. So whilst the CHEV visa had an opportunity or potential for greater regional resettlement or retention for for people from refugee backgrounds, it's really not meeting that need. And whilst more generally we need an overhaul of the temporary protection program in Australia, in the short term, there's the potential for fast tracking of permanent visas for people who move to regional areas. And also there's a potential for expansion and reform of community sponsorship. In Australia, we only have 1,000 of those almost 19,000 places are for community sponsorship. But the problem is that the 1,000, and we actually haven't been meeting that because it's not been a well-formulated program. The 1,000 places comes actually off our overall quota rather than in addition to, and there's a focus on work readiness and coming from particular countries. And so it undermines the potential for the protection principle. It's highly expensive. It's up to about $100,000 in Australia. And it hasn't really facilitated the involvement of local communities in supporting refugees. So there's an opportunity here for expanding and reformulating that program with the potential particularly to work with regional communities. And I think there's some really important lessons here in the Canadian context about how to involve those local communities and to meet the needs around enhanced cohesion and integration. Just recently this week, the Australian government there's some rumblings, nothing's been announced yet, but there's been some rumblings about reformulating that program and looking to Canada as a way of expanding that process. So just in conclusion, so post-pandemic, there is a really important opportunity here to reset some of the policies, particularly enhancing the supports in the regional areas. And so many of the needs are similar to other migrant groups, but there are some specific things that need to be considered for people from refugee backgrounds. In Australia, the punitive and restrictive policies have really undermined the opportunities for a regional resettlement for humanitarian migrants. We need to abolish, and I know this is an Australian specific aspect, but I think it's about saying Canada, I understand, doesn't have a temporary refugee visa, and that's great. So it's about reinforcing that we need to get rid of ours. And I think there's a real opportunity here for looking at the community sponsorship program to promote further regional resettlement for refugees. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate your comments about regional resettlement being mutually beneficial for both refugees and smaller communities. This is something that I think could be acknowledged more in both academic and policy circles. In the Canadian context, at least, there's such an emphasis on economic migration that sometimes the potential benefits of humanitarian migration are overlooked. So thank you for that. At this time, I would like to invite the speakers to briefly react to one another's remarks. So who would like to start us off?
I'm happy to ask Anna a question, if that's okay. Is that too parochial if I ask the other Australian?
That's fine.
Anna, given that the recent change to law that went in yesterday about asylum seekers and detention, and I mean, I guess just this forever detention that refugees who are seeking asylum legally, but not through their humanitarian channel. What impact do you think this is going to have on people's attitudes towards refugees in the regions? Do you think this continued punitive law and approach to humanitarian migrants is just going to make it even harder to settle in smaller regional towns as we move forward?
I mean, absolutely. I don't know how much the colleagues around the screen are aware of how negative the Australian government discourse has been around particularly asylum seekers, but it does spread into the broader refugee population. So yes, in our budget, more money was announced for immigration detention, for offshore and onshore detention than for quarantine hotels to deal with COVID and bringing our populations back. Does really send a message, a negative message that, as you say, rightly point out that seeking asylum is not illegal, but a constant discourse around illegality. And if you look at some of the detention centres, they are absolutely prisons in terms of their look and style. I think it absolutely undermines the notion, and it speaks to not just the comments that you made, Rebecca, about just go home if you don't want to be here, focus only on, our focus is to put any of the support resources around COVID into Australian citizens, definitely speaks to that broader narrative. You can have all the welcome and tolerance and harmony day discourse, but if you undermine it with some of those broader punitive policies, I think it definitely has a knock-on effect. And it has a knock-on effect around all migration, because people in regional towns don't necessarily know if someone's from a refugee background or from another migrant background. So the negative impacts are across the migration program for sure.
If I can ask one question from Rebecca too. So when you mentioned about the government's response, does that mean that there is no interest in the government in immigrant settlement? But as I understand, there are settlement agencies in Australia, and how are they run? Where the funding for them comes from? Because in Canada, large amount of funding is provided to settlement organizations, right, from the government.
Sorry, thank you. I think that there's a little bit of feedback from my computer at the moment, so I apologize. Melissa, is it still coming really scratchily through?
Just a touch. It's okay.
Okay, as soon as I answer this question, I'll put my air traffic controller headphones on. Look, that's a great question. And in fact, I think probably Anna has a lot more information about settlement services than I do. But I think it's varied, right? Like, so in some regional areas, there are no settlement services, especially for smaller towns that are calling out that have skill shortages and are calling out for migrants to come. And so those settlement services are done through other kinds of organizations. In the larger regional areas that have, populations of hundreds of thousands of people, there are a number of different settlement services that are available. Some of these are funded through government grants, and some of these are NGOs, and some of these are auspiced by philanthropic entities. It really depends. So I guess that's part of the problem with regional settlement. When we did our review of regional readiness, we found that regions just vary dramatically in terms of the kinds of services that are available for different kinds of migrants, right? So migrants are a really heterogeneous group. Asylum seekers and humanitarian migrants, they require a different set of circumstances and support than highly skilled migrants. And then highly skilled migrants who speak English as their second language require a very different set of services and supports from migrants who come from English-speaking countries. So there's just such a diversity, I guess, in the migrant population that we've got to be thinking about the kinds of services that regions need, and to be able to at least supply other organizations who are established in those areas with the kind of skill up, the upskilling that would be required to help them help migrants who are wanting to settle there. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but to my mind, the kind of ad hoc informality of some of these arrangements in smaller regional areas is a real problem. But maybe an opportunity for growth, and Anna probably has more information on that.
There's greater involvement of private sector in settlement.
Is the question is there private sector involvement in settlement?
Yeah.
Generally in the humanitarian space, it's non-government organisations involved, so there'll be a settlement provider. There can be some for-profit components to it, but it's generally a contract goes to a particular service in a regional area. But as Rebecca said, it depends on if you're initially settled there as part of your settlement program, where you get a package of supports. If you move to an area after that, you're pretty much on your own in terms of government prescribed services, and then it's a matter of working out what's available. And there's some issues around things being culturally appropriate as well, particularly for people from refugee backgrounds. If there are trauma-informed services, there often aren't, so there can be a real lack there.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question for you, Atha, just about what the kind of what's the view of people in the areas that you're talking about incoming people? Is it seen as, you know, fabulous, we're having people coming to our areas? Is it seen as a negative? Not necessarily. I imagine the coming to the areas in, like in Australia, it's not only, it's internal migration from people who are born in Australia as well as people from overseas. But I just was interested to hear about community attitudes for the receiving communities.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Just to give you an example of 2 years ago, we did a survey of mobility motivations of immigrants in Nova Scotia. So we looked at why people come to Nova Scotia, why do they stay here, and why do they move to other provinces. And we did a Canada-wide survey of about 3,000 immigrants. And people who are staying in Nova Scotia, as well as those who have left, consider Nova Scotia to be a welcoming community. And by welcoming community, they mean there is greater interaction with the local community, greater acceptance in local community. And the main reason why they left the province was because of the economic opportunities. Nova Scotia, being a smaller province, doesn't offer as much economic opportunities as larger provinces do. So this province is, and other Atlantic provinces are viewed as welcoming of immigrants. Now, after the COVID-19 hit these regions, we also did a short survey last month of well-being of immigrants, how immigrants are doing in light of this pandemic. And one of the questions there was if they have found any change in the attitudes of their neighbors. And also if they have found, if the children have found changes in the attitudes of their peers in the school environment. So there was a mixed response, but most survey respondents still felt that there was not much change in the attitudes of the locals here. So mind you, the immigrant population in Nova Scotia is only 6% of total population compared to Ontario, where there is about a 28% in local population. So that is what we are observing now. Not much change due to pandemic, and before the pandemic also the province was viewed as a welcoming community.
Thanks, Atha.
Thank you.
Well, I'd be curious to know if that's also the case in Australia, or if there has been a shift in attitudes in the Australian context. And Clements, please feel free to join the conversation.
You go, Rebecca.
No, you go. I was only just going to fill a gap because I thought no one's responding. You go.
I mean, so there has been, I think Rebecca and I both mentioned that there has been an increase more broadly in negative attitudes. We don't have the data on whether or not it's in particular regions. I mean, I think the discourse around the value of immigration into areas is interesting in regional areas because of this idea about the labour shortages. So one of the big things in Australia has been, because of the pause of the migration program, both humanitarian and otherwise, is that there's a labour shortage in the regional areas. So there's a whole push from some regional areas to try and find ways to bring in workers from particular regions that might be from the Pacific, for example, that might have less COVID. So there's a positive attitude about migration in on one level, but the risk is that it's about, could you come and fill a labour shortage and now you can leave. It's a temporary process. So I'd be very interested to see studies in the regional areas about whether or not how this shift has happened. On one level, we've had negative discourse, particularly around people from Asian backgrounds in Australia around COVID in the early days, particularly, and intolerance more generally. But how is it playing out in the regions? Because it would be interesting to see whether or not an understanding of some of the value, I think it's highlighted some of the value that migrants were really playing in regional communities, although from that temporary basis. So yeah, it'll be interesting as we move forward.
Yeah, I'll just follow up because I think you're absolutely right, Anna. And the other thing that's happening, although there's kind of debate as to whether or not there really is this outpouring of people to the regions, and this kind of gets to the question you were asking, Anna T, about whether or not regions can become smart regions that can host a skilled migration, and we can sort of transcend our traditional working environments to these, you know, more long distance opportunities. My sense is that the outpouring to the regions that people have been talking about as a result of COVID, that the data aren't really supporting that there's this incredible growth in the regions. But if that were to happen, if that's to be sustained, so there's some people are saying, yes, lots of people are moving to the regions now because people are going to be able to work in different ways. And we've got all this innovation around how this is going to work out. But then others who have been tracking growth over a long period of time are saying, well, actually, they're going to the same regions that have been growing at a pretty constant rate anyway. They're not going to some of these regions where the skill shortages are needed. So it's a complex situation, because on the one hand, if some of these regional areas were to grow, they would absolutely need migrant labor. And that could be positive, right? So that could be, we want people to come here. We want their kids to come here. We want these regions to grow, to develop, to thrive. And there could be this real positive approach to regional migration that would come as a result of that. But I think Anna Z also really points out an important point, which is that you're here for a short time and a good time, but not a long time. And that there are caveats to belonging. And I think that these, the recent government changes where permanent migrants now have to wait 4 years for these benefits is just another way of saying, we're not sure if you're going to stay. And so because we're not sure if you're going to stay, we're not going to invest in you as a family. And there are literally tens of thousands of families and individuals who are going to be influenced by these changes in policies. So look, there's heaps of opportunities, and I think this is probably what Australia and Canada share so profoundly. There are so many wonderful opportunities where we could think about migration differently, and where we could have this incredible impact and positive change in the way that we do things. But it's when we're fighting against this kind of government rhetoric, and I think in Australia, this traditional rhetoric around who actually has the right to belong in this country, which is, you know, completely based on migrants. It makes it really difficult. And I probably am not as optimistic about smart regional cities being hubs for skilled migrants and all things fabulous. I think that we're still going to be trudging along in 5 years' time, trying to figure out how to make settlement work in the regions so that migrants stay for longer periods of time.
Okay, thank you all for these great responses. I would now like to pose a few questions from the audience. So this one is directed at all of you. Given the hundreds of billions in stimulus funding flowing into large, mid-sized, and small communities across the country, and acknowledging the fundamental need for a fair and equitable Build Back Better recovery, how can we best ensure that these investments are made with employment equity concerns and obligations attached to all the hiring, training, and promotions? Any takers?
I mean, again, I just feel this need to fill silent gaps. So please tell me to shut up and someone else jump in, please. But I think that's a really good question. I actually think that the private sector in particular has an important role to play here. And I think that sometimes private sector gets moved out of these discussions a little bit because we focus on what government policies are doing and how they might be punitive. And in reality, there's a lot of organizations that see the economic and the social and cultural benefits of migrants, and they're doing amazing things to ensure equity and ensure longevity of migrant settlement in areas, in particular in regional areas. So for example, a number of employers in regional areas around, particularly agricultural areas are trying very hard to create the settlement conditions and have equitable policies to try to get migrants to stay, because it benefits them. I mean, I think at the end of the day, as much as I hate the economic argument's actually phenomenally strong. Migrants make an incredible economic contribution to Australia, and I'm sure the same is true in Canada. So I think that, in fact, some of the innovators around settlement and around inclusion are probably going to be coming from the private sector, because they realize those benefits in material ways. But please, I welcome my other panelists to chat about this too.
Yeah, if I can add to that, it is very important to have the employer involvement in the private sector. It is in the interest of private sector to be equitable, to be non-discriminatory, because by being non-discriminatory and unequitable, they hurt themselves, because private sector is in competition with each other. And while they are in competition with each other, they have to hire the best workers who can be the most productive for them, instead of having attitudes against certain groups. So I think the involvement of private sector here is very, very important.
Thank you. Okay, this is also a question directed at all of you. Could regional, small, and mid-sized cities become smart cities, offering new ways of living and working? For example, living there but working in the large urban centers and only going to the office in person rarely. What are the challenges and opportunities that such an approach would bring?
Well, if I can start, smaller cities have to offer better internet connection, broadband opportunities, a stronger support for internet connection through public libraries and other community centers, which can help people with online connections. That's my 2 cents just to get started. Maybe somebody can follow up on that.
I think Rebecca touched on this before a little bit for Australia, and we do see a little bit of this in some Australian cities where people do live, perhaps an hour or an hour and a half away from some of the bigger cities like Melbourne, and either potentially commute or otherwise virtually go in to the office. And maybe COVID has increased some of these, or made this a little bit more of a normal way to work. I think Rebecca said that she was a little bit hesitant about the possibilities of this, and I would probably agree with that in terms of what we were talking about before around some of the services that might be available in those centres. So things like, what is available in Anna and my research, where we focus on humanitarian migrants and refugees. There's great healthcare needs and mental health care needs, and requirements for really culturally responsive care and trauma-informed approaches, even in, across all sectors, so not just health sectors. And I think that potentially some of those things, that infrastructure isn't necessarily there yet in those small and mid-sized cities to enable that way of working.
Thanks, Clemens. We have a question for Attar. In your assessment, how is the impact of COVID-19 impacting both short and longer term the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Project? Given the lesser impact of COVID in the Atlantic region, does this make immigration to the region potentially more attractive going into the future? And perhaps for our Australian attendees, you could just briefly explain what the Atlantic Immigration Pilot is as well. Thank you.
Yeah, the Atlantic Immigration Pilot involves local employers in immigration programs. There's greater participation of local employers. They are designated employers by the provincial government who look at their employee needs, and they nominate through provincial nominee program. And each province is given a quota in which they can apply towards Atlantic immigration pilot. The pilot was introduced in 2017, so there is not much data there to analyze its impact. However, initial results indicate that those who come under the pilot have higher retention rates. And the employers are playing a greater role in the sense that they are also involved in immigrant settlement and integration. So it's not only that they're offering the jobs, but they also have to help in settlement of the newcomers. Now, what COVID-19 has done is, of course, as has been true around the world, that it has reduced the immigration inflows. Small and mid-sized cities have also been affected by that. But as I was mentioning earlier, that the lower incidence of COVID-19 have made smaller provinces a magnet for both immigrants and non-immigrants alike from other provinces. And there is greater movement now from British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario into Nova Scotia. People are buying houses without even visiting the province. They're buying houses online. And the real estate agents are giving them a tour of the city through drones. So there's a lot of opportunity for small and mid-sized cities after even at the wake of the pandemic.
Thank you, Attar. We have a question for all of the Australians. Does Australia face similar challenges to Canada in that provinces and cities can attract new immigrants or focus refugees resettlement, yet within a couple of years, many of those newcomers leave for larger cities? Perhaps we could start with Anna.
Yeah, absolutely, we do. And it does depend on whether people come from a regional or rural background to start with. So particularly in the humanitarian program, for those who have come from their country of origin in a rural or regional area, there's a real benefit, extra benefit to being in a rural or regional Australian city or town, because it's a lifestyle that they feel familiar with. So for us, it's very much about, from the humanitarian settlement program, matching the right people for an area. Does also depend a lot on the nature of employment opportunities. So whilst I said there's a lot of opportunities in rural and regional Australia around horticulture and agriculture, many people from refugee backgrounds are highly skilled. Sometimes there's issues around having their qualifications recognised, but the nature of the work is not a good fit for them. And then particularly around if you have children and the children are at a certain level of education and schooling, and it does depend on what size area we're talking about. Some of the regional areas are larger and there are employment and educational opportunities that extend beyond some of the smaller areas, but certainly the retention aspect is important, and it does depend across the life course of the family or individuals moving there. Do you agree, Rebecca and Clemmy?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I guess if you haven't been to Australia, it's a little bit like Canada in terms that it's a really vast land. but the variability of these regions is just, it's profound. So some regions you would think would be like a major metropolitan center almost, right? But then, you know, I think Adelaide is actually, under the government's regional migration scheme, is considered a regional area. Adelaide's a thriving city with incredible opportunities, employment and educational, as well as just like surrounded by the best vineyards in the country. But you know, so I think you're absolutely right, and it depends so greatly. And in these smaller areas, there's not a future for highly skilled migrants for their children and for their children's education, which would mean that their children would have to go to other areas to receive that education, and it's not something that's going to keep people there for a long time.
And just at the other end of the spectrum around health services, particularly when people are older, health services are an area of depending again on the size. In Adelaide, we have obviously, you know, good health services, but in some of the smaller areas, so there's an example in of a really small rural area, regional area, that managed to keep a school open by attracting refugee families to the area. There's a lot of engagement from the local community about those families, but in the end, many of the families had to leave because family members needed access to health services, and the school closed in the end. So that access to services is really important for the retention aspect.
I have a sort of follow-up question on that. Research in Canada also shows that secondary migration and relocation after initial arrival is common, especially for refugee groups. And one of the main reasons is moving to locations where ethnic communities are already existing. So would any of you like to comment on this phenomenon and whether you think it's significant?
I'm happy to leap in again there. Absolutely, the size of the cultural community is quite important. So we did some research in Mount Gambier, and we looked at people from a Congolese background and also people from a Myanmar Burmese Karen background. And over time, the Karen community had grown quite large in Mount Gambier, and it was seen to be quite an extensive support network for the people there, but the Congolese had only 20 to 30 families, and what you started to see was the drift away from Mount Gambier into the bigger cities, for the reasons that I talked about before in terms of employment and education, but also for a broader cultural community.
Great, thank you, Anna. We're rapidly running out of time, so I'd just like to give each of the speakers the opportunity to make some closing statements if you wish to do so, just very briefly. Clements, anything you would like to add to the discussion?
It's been really interesting to hear what everyone's had to say and to engage in these thoughts around small and mid-sized cities. I think in closing, you know, I'd echo what Rebecca said. In Australia, we have great diversity. Some of these areas might be a few hundred people, and some of them, you know, would be like Adelaide. So there is going to be a really big difference. But I think I think addressing attitudes is going to be one of the big key things that we can try and do, especially in Australia, where those discourses are really negative and have been for a really long time.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you like to give us some final?
I feel like I've had my talking time, so I'm going to just be very brief and thank everyone so much for having me, and to just say that I completely agree with Clements. Our challenge is very much around cultural inclusion and welcome, and I think regardless of what happens economically, that remains our challenge, and I know that I'm working alongside really amazing people in this space in Australia to ensure that we improve that moving forward. So thank you.
Thanks. And Attar.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And this was a very interesting discussion. And I will just say, come to Atlantic Canada. You will enjoy it here.
Thank you. And finally, Anna, anything you would like to conclude with?
Just thank you again. Great to hear the cross-country discussions. It'd be good to hear more from the Canadian experience in the future. Concur with Clemmy and Rebecca around the kind of attitudinal aspect. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in small and mid-sized cities around that process by which communities move into an area and how to involve that local community in that process, how to help plan it out. An ad hoc settlement process doesn't work. And if there's a planned and consultative process with local champions and steering committees that manage it, and a good match between the incoming and receiving communities, there's real opportunities, but it's an area of important work in the future.
That's great. Thank you so much. All right, well, with that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our 4 panelists today for their willingness to share their ideas and for all their insightful remarks. It's been a great discussion. And I would also like to thank all members of the audience for engaging with the presentations and for posing really excellent questions. Please remember that each of our speakers will have a blog featured on the Migrant Futures blog space, so be sure to check that out. And this webinar is part of a series of webinars focusing on the future of migration following the pandemic. So I would encourage you to check out the CERC migration website or subscribe to our newsletters so that you can stay informed about future webinars and events if you have an interest in this topic. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope to see you soon. Goodbye.